Welcome to SEL 101, the crash course for parents in social emotional learning. Let's get this started right away. We're going to open in prayer with Ms. Kathy Harms.
If you could just bow your head for just a second or two here. Lord, we come again confessing our total reliance on you for your wisdom in the decisions that we make that affect our children and future generations. Lord, we ask you to help us to remember that they're all unique individuals created by you, and that you would give us grace to direct and help them establish the path that you have set before them, Lord. We ask that you help us restore once again the vision that includes recognizing that our children are vulnerable and they require our protection from any entity with a special interest or agenda that would cause them to the breakdown of the family or violate the boundaries of faith and family, Lord. We instead then ask you to help us affirm for them your love and care for them, giving us the ability to protect and care for them, guiding them with the resources that give you glory and enable them and nourish them in their lives as they grow. Thank you. In Jesus' name.
Thank you, Kathy. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Robin Steenman. I'm the chapter chair for the Williamson County Moms for Liberty. And I'm so happy that you're all here tonight to learn more about this critical issue facing our students in Williamson County and Tennessee schools and schools nationally. Tonight is part of our 2022-2023 school year for parents. There are so many issues facing parents these days when they're advocating for their children in the school system. When you start to look at all of these topics at once, it's quite overwhelming, and parents get the kind of glazed over, deer in the headlights look of this is just too much to comprehend. So what we're doing in this school year for parents is we're breaking down one topic per month, and it's a multi-pronged effort. It comes with a 101 course, an online toolkit, an assigned reading, and so on. We'll cover that more later. But SEL 101 is part of October's focus on social emotional learning, which is absolutely a critical issue facing our students. Now, how did we first find out about social emotional learning? For this chapter, we really formed to combat critical race theory. And if you remember, in May and June of 2021, about 30 parents came together and put in 1,200 hours in a deep dive of the Wit and Wisdom curriculum that's in our elementary schools. And what we really thought was we're just going to find critical race theory. And we did find pockets of critical race theory. What we really found was wall-to-wall social emotional learning facilitating pockets of critical race theory. And that was our first introduction to it. Social emotional learning is hard to define. It's kind of a, well, you know it when you see it affair. And when you look at this curriculum, and who remembers these slides from June of 2021, when you look at these slides and you see, oh, suicide ideation in multiple grades, mean white people starting in kindergarten, extreme emotion, anti-family, cannibalism, anti-Americanism, dark imagery, graphic death, and age-inappropriate topics. It's not just critical race theory. There's some critical race theory in this, but it is just emotion, 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 darkness, negativity, age-inappropriate topics that, what does it play to? Well, your child's emotion. So without really understanding SEL yet, I said, well, we're looking at SEL. But tonight we're here to help all of us understand it better. And when I say age-inappropriate topics, what am I talking about? In kindergarten, an emphasis on murder. In second grade, graphic mating and an intro to gender fluidity. In second grade, anti-police and fire department. The third grade was heavily anti-church and torture. The fourth grade featured rape, murder, adultery, scalping, skinning, and stillbirth. And in the fifth grade was excessive gore, violence, alcoholism, and promiscuity. Now, who sends their kid to school each day to learn about these topics? So what is it? You know it when you see it, but how do you define it? Because until you define something, you can't fight against it. You can't push back. You have to get smart on it in order to combat it, in order to advocate for your child in the school environment. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Jennifer McWilliams. Jennifer is an educator who was terminated from her teaching position for opposing social emotional learning. She has spent the last 3 years fighting the indoctrination in K-12 schools and supporting parental rights. She is a teacher ambassador for Kids and Country and a consultant for Courage as a Habit. She is here tonight to help you nail the jello to the wall by clearly defining social emotional learning. Please welcome Jennifer McWilliams.
Thank you, Robin. Okay. Hi. So great to be here. I travel a lot and speak to a lot of groups and a lot of places, but I am incredibly thankful and excited to be here because what has happened here in this county and with parent leaders like yourself is something that should have a domino effect in this country. And this lawsuit against Wit and Wisdom is the first of its kind, and I am beyond thrilled to be part of it in some way. Make sure my slides are lined up here. Okay, so I'm here to speak to you about social emotional learning, and I have been at this for 3 years, and I was a teacher at a very rural town in Indiana that, sorry, my slides are not cooperating here on the, my town, so what I like to tell people is my town did not even have a stoplight, okay? So when people think that this problem is isolated to big cities or very progressive areas, they are misinformed because this is something that is happening all over the country. This is in, I would say at this point probably 100%, but I'm always careful to say that. Because there will be one person out there that will say, no, Jennifer, she's lying. But at least over 90% of the public education system. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight as far as social emotional learning goes is relevant to anybody that you know, even if they're in another state, they use a different social emotional learning program. It doesn't matter if it's Republican, if it's Democrat, it does not matter, okay? So social emotional learning is the complete transformation of our education system to psychologically manipulate this generation of children to believe critical race theory as objective truth. Okay? So if you've ever went to your school board or your administration and you said, why are you teaching critical race theory to my children? They probably said, we're not. But that's a lie. They're not teaching them what the theory is. They have transformed the entire system around the theory, and that is how they're teaching it. So SEL is a thought reform program that undermines parents and replaces them with the government, and I'm going to explain this better for you. So I'm definitely not the critical race theory expert in the room, but I do like to start with this, and because of the area I'm in, this is probably not necessary, but for someone that might be watching, I cover very basically what critical race theory is, just in case someone is not familiar with it. So critical race theory is the idea that our country was founded on oppression and racism, and everything that all of our systems are operating to uphold white supremacy and the inequities that would create in our country. And critical race theory brings in what they call intersectionality. So that is this wheel that you see here. And it might be hard to see. This is a very basic one. They have ones that are very complicated, and you can find, when it gets down to it, if you want to break everyone down into their identities and their characteristics, we all are unique. So you would have a ton of them. But for the basic level, people that believe in critical race theory look at our country and people, individuals, as having a place in each of these categories. So geographic location, race, gender, sexual orientation, documented, undocumented religion, ability status, socioeconomic status, country of origin, age, education, and language. So depending on where you fall in each of those categories, you as an individual lie somewhere on a hierarchy of oppressed and privileged. And based on where you lie on that hierarchy determines in the education system now how your education should be delivered to you. Critical race theorists believe in dismantling what they will call the inequitable systems. And the other point I will make about this is that if you are a critical race theorist, you believe every system in our country is inequitable. So if you're going to dismantle the inequitable systems, what they're talking about is dismantling America. Okay, I'm going to explain how this works in the education system, and I'm going to give you just a little bit of information on social emotional learning. And this is a massive network of supporters, but these are some that you will probably be familiar with. Organizations that support social emotional learning are Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, the Southern Poverty Law Center, UNESCO, the United Nations, National Equity Project, World Economic Forum, Planned Parenthood, and the National Education Association Teachers Union. I skipped the one I'm going to focus on a little bit that you may not have heard of. It's called the Fetzer Institute. And the Fetzer Institute is actually where the term social emotional learning and its housing unit, which is called CASEL, C-A-S-E-L, and that stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. That is the organization that really controls the strings of how social emotional learning will work in your school. Both of those things, the term and the organization was founded at the Fetzer Institute in 1994. So briefly, and especially, the hope is to get this out of the education system completely. And, I'm so thankful that your state and your group and area have been able to start to lead the way with using the critical race theory ban to go after social emotional learning. But it's possible there are people here that live or listening that have that live in states that did not ban critical race theory, and I want everyone to understand this should be the domino effect across the country, but the critical race theory ban is not the only entryway to destroy social emotional learning. It is a violation of our First Amendment, social emotional learning is. And so if you're in a state that doesn't have critical race theory, what I'm going to say right now could possibly apply to you if you want to use it. Social emotional learning and CASEL were, like I said, formed at the Fetzer Institute in 1994. The Fetzer Institute was an organization or an institute that was founded by a man by the name of John Fetzer. And John Fetzer, he was a very successful man. He was big in radio. He did a lot of things. Actually, he owned, I believe, the Detroit tigers, I believe it was, and but he was a very wealthy man. But a lot of people during that time didn't realize that his real mission and in life was his spirituality. And so at some point he had abandoned his Christianity, and this is not a religious talk for anyone to carry on anyway. I believe everybody in this country can do what they want. But for the sake of social emotional learning, John Fetzer abandoned his Christianity upbringing, and he really dove into the idea of occult practices. He was a devout follower of Alice Bailey, and Alice Bailey was, she's known as the mother of the New Age spirituality and occult practices, and she believed in a one world order, and she believed in a global education system, network. So she passed, and John Fetzer decided to continue to carry out this mission and vision. He founded, and for that purpose he took his wealth and he founded the Fetzer Institute. In 1994, they brought this group of very selective individuals to the Fetzer Institute to form what, in their theory of change, they lay out that they needed an entry point into education so that they could then bring in their spirituality and shift the consciousness of the children, but they had to have an entry point that was deceptive and that people wouldn't recognize. And that entry point was social emotional learning. Hanging with me here. I don't usually have two things going here. Okay, so I have information on my blog about that, but that's an important point for people to understand, is that there is a way to fight this in every state, and it needs to be done. So one of the things, as I have talked for 3 years now to groups, that has been extremely, confusing for parent groups or people to understand, and why I think that it took so long for people to realize something, is happening in education, and it's not just a fad, it's actually a systemic change, is that social emotional learning is extremely deceptive. They use language as a weapon. When I was fired from my school for speaking out against social emotional learning, the program that I had was called Leader in Me. And so I didn't realize it at the time. I have a much better understanding of social emotional learning now, even though at the time I knew that what we were doing was very wrong. And so when I was speaking out against it, I was saying, well, there's this program, Leader in Me, social emotional learning. Very few people could connect with what I was saying, because there are over 100 social emotional learning programs used in schools across our country. So just because I was talking about Leader in Me, the school next to me might be using something like Second Step, or they might be using Conscious Discipline, or they might be using Wit and Wisdom, okay? But it doesn't matter what the program is. It doesn't matter what the language is that they use for that program. They all operate the same way, and they all have the same goal, and it is to separate the child from the parents, to create a new consciousness, and to connect and force everyone into this new global order that they're trying to push. So it doesn't matter. Again, Wit and Wisdom. We can take the same lawsuit that was here in Williamson County and apply it to any school across the country with a little bit of adjustments. Of course, we'd have to look at it, use some of their language, but really you can take out the words wit and wisdom and replace it with any of these programs. And again, these are only a few. There are over 100. It's a pyramid scheme on the backs of the government, taxpayers. Okay, so all of those programs, all 100 of them, operate and follow the same guidelines, and they all come from CASEL. This is the organization that was founded at the Fetzer Institute that I was talking about. And again, CASEL stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And all of those programs, just like Wit and Wisdom, follow this framework, okay? So it doesn't matter, again, don't get caught on the language, whatever your program is called, dig in their website and you will find this seemingly innocent framework, which is actually an absolute disaster and monster. So this is the framework, and in social emotional learning, when it comes into your school, it claims that it is going to teach empathy and build relationships and help children manage their emotions. And everybody wants that for their children, right? Everybody wants that. But they say, we're going to teach the life skills that children need. And these are the life skills that they say. Self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And again, those are all skills that we want our children to have. Those are all skills that we teach our children. But the problem is, by whose standards and values and morals are they being taught? And I will tell you. They deliver social emotional learning and these competencies through what they call an equity lens. And when you hear equity lens, what you need to realize is what they're talking about is through the viewpoint of a critical race theorist, someone that believes that our country is systemically oppressive and systemically racist and believes that our country needs to be dismantled. That is how they deliver these skills. When social emotional learning came into the school, they literally sold it in one of their first publications as parents can no longer teach their children the life skills that they need to be successful. I want you to think about that. Parents cannot teach their children the life skills that they need to be successful. So the government needs to do it for them. Okay? Now, if you can't teach your child life skills, basic life skills such as these, to be successful in life, you surely cannot teach them spirituality. You cannot teach them, or you cannot make medical decisions for them. If you can't teach basic life skills, then the government is going to raise your child. And they have determined that Americans are too busy to do that. So the way that this works is, it's not cooperating, but I can see it here. Okay, so these 5 competencies, if you look at any social emotional learning program or your state education department, they will talk about these competencies being taught in all grades, kindergarten through 12th grade. But the way that this actually works, and children will grab a hold of this idea at different levels, so that's why they push it in all levels. But the way that this works is it is a thought reform program to get children to shift the way that they think about the world. So there's a heavy influence in the orange area, which is self-awareness and self-management. And the reason that they do this is because you need to get children, to get them on the path of this thought reform, you have to get children to realize they have an identity, and it's predetermined, and their identities are either contributing to society as a privilege or oppression, and they need to do something about it. So they have to categorize these children. That's why you see a lot of books. That's why children show up in kindergarten and they say, "What's your pronoun?" And kids don't even know what their pronoun is. But they have to get the kids on the cycle of realizing this. Once kids realize what their identities are, they have to start pushing the idea of responsible decisions. And if you're going to make responsible decisions, it's not like responsible decisions like I would teach my children. Responsible decisions in this framework is based on your role in society as a privileged person or oppressed, and you need to act accordingly. okay? So through this system, if you turn 18 and you are a white male, if this thought reform system works correctly, you realize your identity and that you are privileged in society, and your responsible decision would be something like vote for reparations. This is a thought reform program. Once you get children to start thinking about making decisions based on their identities, you move them around to the green, which is where they want them. The relationship skills and social awareness, there's a heavy focus of these skills in the upper grades, because this is where you have them understanding identities, decisions, and now you train them to be activists for the cause. So every social emotional learning program uses this, with the exception of one that I don't know that is in any schools. But this is what you're looking for. So anybody that says it's not happening in my school, any administrator, any school board member that says that's not how we do it, yes, it is. Look through the website and find this, because it's exactly what it is. Okay, reality intervention. Social emotional learning changed the way that students learn by implementing a political teaching method that develops a radical ideological viewpoint of the world. So social emotional learning was a systemic change. It came in and it changed the language so that parents didn't recognize what they're doing with those competencies. It changed the idea where at one time it was a parent's job to teach the life skills that children need. Now it's the government's job to teach what children need. And it changed the way that we taught children. It changed it because it shifted from a traditional teaching method to what is called a culturally responsive teaching method. And again, I want everyone, even if you're listening from a different state, to understand this is happening in your state. This is in every state Department of Education. You can look up culturally responsive teaching or cultural competence. You will find it. But the problem is a lot of people didn't understand what that meant. Okay? So culturally responsive teaching is a method from a woman by the name of Gloria Ladson-Billings. And Gloria Ladson-Billings, you can find her if you look her up. She is a very outspoken, to this day, woman who says flat out, I am a critical race theorist, and I was before Barack Obama was elected president, and I am afterwards. She believes the only reason that Obama was elected to presidency is because at that time it was to uphold white supremacy. Okay, she took the ideas of Paulo Freire, which I know James Lindsay educates often about. We'll probably talk about, but and which goes back to Marxism, to push the idea that any time that you are teaching children, you use whatever the context is, whether it's just a conversation or it's an actual lesson, to engage children in conversations around the idea of oppression and privilege. So it's CRT, and people get confused. I call it the other CRT. It's actually the praxis of critical race theory in the education system. But culturally responsive teaching uses lessons as a way to engage students, like I just said, in conversations around systemic privilege and oppression. One of the things that is heavy in this, and I know that it was noticed when they reached out to me about wit and wisdom, was the stories that they were using with these programs and how they deal in heavy situations of emotions and oppression and revisionist history, things that are not always accurate in what was shaping the overall history of our country. And with critical race theory, one of the tenets is counter-storytelling. And counter-storytelling is the idea of continuously over and over and over telling these children or people the opposite side of whatever it is traditionally that has been told. Okay? And they are doing this through the resources and materials that they're bringing in, such as wit and wisdom, in the education system. So culturally responsive teaching is supposed to be used all day, every day in your children's life. So in every subject area, they are supposed to be teaching culturally responsive. And culturally responsive teaching, again, exploits the experiences and emotions of children. So I'm going to give you an example, okay? I went through a lot of training on this. You can give me anything. You can give me anything, and I can make it political, and I wish I couldn't, but I can because I've read so much and went through the training on this. But I'm going to give you something that we're all probably familiar with in this room, okay? Pretend you're in second grade for a minute, right? That would be nice. Not so much worry in the world. But this is a typical math problem that you might hear, okay? Johnny was on the way to an amusement park with his mom and dad. The park was a total of 50 miles away. They already drove 20 miles. How many more miles do they need to drive? Doesn't seem like a big deal, right? But this is what parents can't put their finger on. This is what you can't grab and say, why are you doing this? Because it's the method that they have taught these teachers to use. It's what culturally responsive teaching is. And so when you go to the school and you look at the curriculum's a lot of times, they'll let you see the curriculum. It's you can't pick it out because you can't pick out this. Now, when you get into social emotional learning and third-party resources, it's heavily used in those areas, but those things are protected by third-party proprietary laws, so parents can't see them. But back to the teaching method. So you cannot see, how could I possibly make this political? How can I use this as a thought reform math problem? Okay, so I'm teaching this, I give the kids this problem, and if I was a culturally responsive teacher, I would say something like, let's not worry about the answer right now. How many of you have been to an amusement park? Okay, and then you have these very young children, of course they want to tell you, right? So you have maybe half of them raise their hand, they've been to an amusement park, okay? And then you have children that don't, okay? And then you say, well, okay, I see some of you went, but I also see that some of you haven't went. So what reasons would there be that some kids haven't been to an amusement park? You would have some child that would say, because they throw up on the rides, right? So they want to share everything. Sure, some kids don't like to go to the amusement park. They don't want to go, they're afraid of the rides. What's another reason? Why? Culturally responsive teaching exploits the emotions of these children and life experiences to push this idea of privileged and oppression, okay? And so I would say, what's another reason? And then you keep going until you get one of these children to say, some people can't afford it. Some people can't afford it. That's right, some people can't afford to go to a music park. So, you know, if you had the power, what would you do, class? What would you do to fix that? Now you're talking about very young children. What are they going to say? Make it free. Make it free. Here's another way. Maybe the teacher doesn't go that route. You can make it culturally responsive teaching like this. Johnny was going to a music park with his mom and dad. That's interesting. Do all families have a mom and a dad? I know a lot of families have mom and dad, but if you know of different families that have different, makeups, raise your hand and tell me about them. You have a child. Well, I live just with my mom. My parents are divorced. Okay? You have a child that says, well, I have a mom and dad, but down the road I have, there's two moms, right? Now, there's your entry point. If you're a culturally responsive teacher, and this is your agenda, is to manipulate the children, there's your entry point. Now you can have this conversation with young children. That's what culturally responsive teaching is. And again, you can give me anything, and I can turn it into this, unfortunately. Okay, another part of culturally responsive teaching, again, that was recognized with wit and wisdom, was the resources. The books are a huge part of that, and I was talking about that with the counter storytelling. But these are just a few of the examples. So they flood the libraries, and the resources which you must pay attention to, like Wit and Wisdom, the online databases, the teachers pay teachers, that's another big one. But all of these things that are used that you have to pay some sort of money for, that it builds a barrier so that parents and people can't see the whole picture of what they're doing. They flood those resources and materials with things like this. This would be for younger children. So you would read very young children, they, she, he, easy as ABC, to introduce the idea of pronouns. My princess boy, Heather has two mommies, a tale of two daddies. I put the one in the middle, a different dragon, just because people have to realize you can't just look at the cover. This is about a family with same gender parents. But they flood this in as an objective truth and something that all families should accept. And if you don't, then you are being oppressive to your child. In the upper grades, culturally responsive teaching will use resources like this. Now, your teachers will say, well, we're just following the standards. We're just asking them questions like what's in the standards. We're asking them, to analyze a situation or to, think about the setting or whatever their standards are. But these are the things they're using to do it. Okay, so it's a whole other idea and narrative than what a lot of families want taught to their children. It's not their place. If there is a family that wants to teach their child that way, so be it. But the government should not be doing this. So you get books flooded into the libraries that are heavy in the idea of sexuality and critical race theory, gender ideology, and so this would all be part of the culturally responsive school or environment that they're trying to build. I'm going to go a little bit faster here, but social credit scores. So social emotional learning is collecting a massive amount of mental health data on children through surveys. This data is creating a psychological profile for students by analyzing their personality traits. If you don't know about the surveys and the data collection, this is something that you need to look into immediately, okay? Social emotional learning is what they call data-driven. It's fraudulent data. It's to push their radical ideology, but it's data-driven. Well, how do they get that data? Now, there's programs and apps that collect the data, but specifically, in this area, am talking about the surveys. So they give children surveys or questionnaires, and a lot of times when parents see the questions on those surveys, they think, it's not a big deal, right? Because the schools say, we're just checking on the climate, we just want everybody to belong. And the questions are very difficult, they're very innocuous to really put your finger on what they could possibly do wrong with it, okay? But essentially, they give children a very subjective survey, and then whatever data they get, they interpret it through that equity lens. So it's not interpreted the way I would interpret this. So I'm going to give you an example. This is actually an example from a social emotional learning survey. How confident are you that you can complete all the work that is assigned in your classes? Okay. The children answer these questions. The data goes out. It's interpreted through the equity lens, and it comes back to the school, and it says, well, this is the next step in your social emotional learning systemic program. Okay, you have to use this data, and you have to make a change to your system to try to make up these gaps in the numbers for the idea of equity. So they put it through the equity lens, and it says this score indicates school culture is suppressing their ability to complete work. So what is the answer to that? The intervention that they will bring in, increase counseling services for students with lower scores to investigate ways to improve school culture, more Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ representation, flags, and clubs, more social justice and sexuality books in the library. That is how you answer, how confident are you that you can complete all the work that is assigned to you? That's not how I would answer that question. Okay? So if you don't like what's going on in the school, you have to understand they are not looking at it like you. They're manipulating the language. They're interpreting in a very fraudulent way to push a very radical ideology onto these children, and it will never stop. You get the results you want as long as you interpret the data in a way that gets you there. The surveys are a self-fulfilling prophecy, okay? And this is how it works. So they bring in SEL and they say, we're going to do this program. It costs a ton of money. We'll give you a grant to get you going. Of course, the taxpayers will have to pick it up later. But we're going to check on how you're doing with this system through surveys, collecting data. It's data-driven. So based on what the surveys say, we will adjust our social emotional learning program to meet those needs. And it's all about you and your school and your community and your culture. It's a lie. It's all about this one idea. But that's what they tell you. Okay? So you give in-class surveys that collect the student data. The data is interpreted through the equity lens. The results are stored and evaluated. The results require changes to the school culture. And each step of the way, the students are more and more radicalized by the new culture to create a new social norm and a new consciousness for your children. And this cycle goes over and over and over until they get what they want. This data is being stored and kept by our government in what's called statewide longitudinal data systems. Okay? And these systems are in every state. There's massive amounts of grant money. They're pouring into the schools to build these systems bigger and stronger and with the ability to collect more and more data and analyze all of it. Statewide longitudinal data systems. What are they doing with that data? This is for our government. This data, a lot of times you will see where it says P-W20. That's because what they mean is preschool through the workforce. This is data that they're collecting. Across the nation, it's happening at least at third grade. In the last couple of years, they started doing it with kindergarten. I said, maybe not in every school, but that's where they've started. I said, well, how can you collect data like this on a survey from a kindergartner? Half of them can't tie their shoes. And they said, well, we let the teachers answer. Do you want the teachers to answer those survey questions for your child? I don't, because I know what they think about me. But so it's P-W, preschool through workforce. This is building a social credit score for your child. And the credit score, again, is based on this fraudulent data, and that data is determining how well your child is conforming to this new thought reform, this new consciousness, this brainwashing. You can look it up. You'll find it in your Tennessee statewide longitudinal databases. They're turning our schools into mental school clinics. The social emotional learning is a trauma-informed practice. A lot of people don't realize that it places every child in a mental health intervention system. So if your child's in a school with social emotional learning, whereas before, children that received, it's called MTSS, multi-tiered system of support, if you were put into tier 1, you were actually identified based on your individual needs. But social emotional learning came in as a collective need. Because again, parents, you can't teach your children life skills anymore. So we have to do it for you, all of you. And so it places every single child into the first tier because social emotional learning is an intervention. It is a mental health intervention. To me, that says enough. Did they tell you this? Did they tell you that they put your child in a mental health program and they're receiving an intervention for it? The idea behind this is that not individual trauma or needs, it is systemic trauma and needs. This system requires the school counselors to work as social justice advocates who shift the school culture to emphasize racism, gender ideology, and sexual preference. This systemic change is disguised by innocuous language such as welcoming and safe schools. Have you heard that language? Probably. When you hear welcoming and safe schools, this is what they're talking about. It's not welcoming for me, I can tell you that. So the final thing here I'm going to expose, my time's almost up, but the school counselors, okay? So you have the social emotional learning programs, such as Wit and Wisdom, that use and bring in resources and materials that are delivered through that equity lens, through culturally responsive teaching, and you have them collecting data and manipulating it and using it to push this idea. Look, I'm sure Mr. Lindsay has as well. I have been all over this country. I've talked to people from probably at this point all 50 states. And everyone says, well, I think we're doing it a little different. You're not. Nobody's doing it differently. Every state, every school district is doing it the same. You might be a little farther along than others. I'll give you that. Everyone's doing it the same. There's nothing different. There's nothing about your community that's coming in through this. There's nothing about your culture that's coming into this. This is all about creating a one world order. So the school counselors, you have the teachers that shift the culture of the classroom and use the culture responsive teaching. The school counselors are responsible for shifting the culture of the school. At one time, these are not guidance counselors, and they get mad if you call them that because they say, we're not guidance counselors, that's only for children that need it. We're school counselors. All children need us. They changed this mission back around 2014, 2015, under the Michelle Obama's Reach Higher First Lady initiative. And they did this by coming in and saying, you know, let's make school counselors social justice advocates. Not my language. That's theirs. They're going to go into school, they're going to be social justice advocates. And because social emotional learning is trauma-informed practice, intervention, now every child in the school has to be influenced through the counseling system in some way. And that could be one-on-one meetings, it could be small group, it could be whole class instruction, or at least through the culture of the school that they're responsible for now shifting. I am fortunate enough to be able to consult and work with an organization, if you haven't heard of, Courage is a Habit. And over the summer, we actually attended the American School Counseling Association, ASCA is what we call them, their annual conference. And if you want to talk about something that's terrifying, to know that this is a blatantly political Marxist organization that our country has allowed to take over the counseling, the mental health services that we provide for this generation, the majority of this generation's children, in the school, and most people still think they're just going to the guidance counselor and figuring out if they should take English or advanced English. That's not what they do anymore. So their conference was called No Limits, which is pretty creepy when you're talking about children. And they had you probably can't see it, so I'm going to read their agenda for you. Anti-racism starts with us. Become an LGBTQ inclusive school. Legal and ethical considerations. Student surveys. Equity in action through systemic change. Teach grad students trauma-informed practices. Support transgender and gender-expansive students. School counselors, legal literacy, and ethical practice. It goes on from there. This is from their 2021 position statement. It is an expectation, not the exception, for school counselors to integrate multiculturalism and social justice perspectives into their work as advocates and leaders. They are political activists who, under SEL, are responsible for influencing your children. The ethical chair of ASCA during that conference told a story about a counselor that had a child come to them and said, I wanted birth control, but my mom won't let me get it. And so the counselor decided to take this child to get birth control, and then asked the ethical chair, who was the president of ASCA for years, and the ethical chair for like 20 years. She's just now retiring. Her name's Carolyn Stone. Asked her, what should I do? And her response was, hold your breath and pray. Okay? They hide behind the idea of, and this is why, sorry, in just a minute. I'm going to go on to the next slide, but this is why we call it behind closed doors. Because their job is to teach children that all of this ideology that we're all here trying to stop. Okay, so I thought I had one more slide, but so it's confidential. The last thing I want you to understand is these school counselors, confidentiality, they are exploiting that. Now, everyone understands in public education or education at all, but public education, you absolutely have children that come to school that need adults without an agenda to be looking out for their best interests. This is why they're mandated reporters. Okay? You understand that there are children that come that have been abused, that have needs that aren't being met, and I'm talking about true abuse cases, and not the idea of they're not being taught life skills because they can't sit still. They're being children. But you need that. But what's happening is these counselors are exploiting the idea of confidentiality and safe and welcoming schools, because now it is assumed that the place that the child is coming from is not safe. It is not safe. And the only thing, they will say, if you read their stuff, they say, well, we want to work with parents. Well, they only want to work with parents that believe in this ideology. They only want to work with parents that put their little children in the car and drive them to the clinic to mutilate their body for the idea of transgenderism. That's the parents they want to work with. If your child goes in there to these counselors and says, you can fill in the blank, I am pregnant and I am afraid to tell my parents. I am a girl, but I think I'm a boy, but my parents don't agree. I want to, I want birth control. I'm sexually active and my parents are trying to tell me not to be. I want to change my name. I want to have surgery. Fill in the blank and then just add, but I'm afraid to tell my parents. Done. Under the idea of confidentiality, the parents at that point could be the abuser in the situation, and they will be able to hide it from you. And that is the truth. We have all the documentation for it, and this is why we have a massive social contagion happening in our schools. It is being pushed by this radical ideology. Social emotional learning is exploiting the emotions of these children to try to, they're teaching them using neuroscience techniques, calming, hypnosis techniques to try to get them to calm down as we shift the consciousness of our country, because they're creating a cognitive dissonance. You have children that go home and hear their parents saying something, and then they go to school, and the idea is that your parents are out of date. They don't know better. And this isn't, do you want to go to the concert Friday night? My parents won't let me. They're just old and out of touch, right? We all went through that. This is a whole other destruction. Okay, so my time is about up. I know that's really a very quick overview of social emotional learning. I cannot express how proud I am to be any part of what's happening here. And I hope that what has been done here and this lawsuit with Wit and Wisdom is the domino effect across this country. I will help anyone that is able to bring a lawsuit against this. And I'm sure others here will too. I won't speak for them. So here's some things that you can do that I will just leave you with. So understand the language of Marxism. You have an amazing speaker tonight, James Lindsay, who will help you understand that, as he has helped so many, because it's deceptive and what they say is not what they mean. And so you cannot go and fight back if you don't understand their language. They don't mean the things that you think they mean. It's all been redefined. Break down the SEL system and players. Again, I've worked with Courage as a Habit, and they have free tools and resources for people like you to use. They have a decoding series that breaks it down in very small, simple parts that you can use and pull what you want to address in that moment. Don't give labels power, okay? I've been called everything you can imagine. I don't care. I know what I am. And speaking across this country, people are afraid. People are afraid. Don't even give it attention. Let them say what they're going to say. We're protecting these children. If you are afraid to be called something, imagine what your children are going to go through. Organize and stay engaged. Opt out of the surveys. Get everyone you know to get out of the surveys. Watch the grants and contracts coming into your school district, every single one of them. It's bad news, usually. It just drives more of this data collection, more of these resources that are harming the children. And then my favorite is started right here. Bring on the lawsuits. Okay, bring on the lawsuits. When I started my mission back in, I started teaching in 2019. By February of 2020, my school fired me for posting in my own time a blog post about the Leader in Me program that was all true, and I did it on my personal social media in my own time. My school fired me. I'm 2 years into a federal First Amendment lawsuit that I will win, and I will encourage other teachers to do the same thing. Use our Constitution while we have it. But back then when I talked about this, nobody knew what was going on. Everybody thought I had lost my mind. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of hope as I exit stage here. So that happened, and I kept going, what are we going to do? Like, I don't know if there's anything we can do, but I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And this wasn't all because of me, but this is where I was at. And then slowly but surely, people were starting to go, what's wrong? COVID happened, if you want a silver lining, right? If you want a silver lining, people realize something is seriously wrong in the education system. And then people started talking about critical race theory. And at the time, I kept going, it's not critical race theory, it's social emotional learning. But then I realized, wait, you have to understand critical race theory before you can understand social emotional learning. This is great. Talk about it. Great. Critical race theory. And then, OK Groomer became a thing on Twitter. And it got banned, so I bought a shirt. This is OK Groomer, and I do videos in it now, so we can still put it on Twitter. And then James Lindsay got banned from Twitter, and those sound like bad things, but actually what it means is they're terrified. They're terrified of people like you. They're terrified of the truth, and then the most amazing thing, the wit and wisdom. Lawsuits, and I hope that gives you some encouragement to continue supporting this, help donate when you can to this cause, because it really can be the landmark situation that we need in this country to start pushing back. So I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. You're welcome. Which clicker do I? Okay. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Tricia Lucente, and I started Parents' Choice Tennessee, and we're co-hosting this with Moms for Liberty. And I can't even begin to tell you how grateful I am for our relationship with Moms for Liberty and with Jennifer McWilliams and James Lindsay. So our organization filed a lawsuit against Williamson County School Board and a few administrators in Penny Schwinn, because they are teaching critical race theory, and they are doing it via social emotional learning. Wit and Wisdom is our English language arts curriculum here in Williamson County for elementary school, and it is a proud social emotional learning framework curriculum. It focuses more on political literacy than it does at all, actual literacy. Our children are not learning how to read, but they are learning how to be seeing the world through the eyes of the equity lens. And so when I started looking into this, and when my son started bringing books home and things like that, I started to realize, the term woke is somebody who's been awakened to all these equity terms. And that is somebody that has the lens of the equity lens. They are seeing the world as a critical theorist. So then I thought to myself, what happens when they put those glasses on a 7-year-old? What happens when our 6- and 7-year-olds are seeing the world as a critical theorist? Is there going to be any undoing that when they're 20, when they're 30, when they're a politician, when there are doctors and our lawyers and our mortgage brokers and our homeless? And I really don't think there is. So it kind of turned into a what can we do about this? And the more we dug, the more we realized there's a lawsuit here. They are violating, by teaching these concepts, the prohibited concepts laws in the state of Tennessee. They are teaching Common Core, and they are using social emotional learning to prod at the feelings of our children. And just to give you a quick example, in second grade, when they teach the civil rights module, which is 9 weeks, they spend over 40 hours talking about civil rights history, and this is in English language arts. They say injustice 106 times. They talk about, they ask the children, how does it make you feel? How do you feel? And tell me about your feelings over 76 times. And they say the word hero 3 times. So the focus is on their feelings, and the focus is on social justice, and it's wrong, and it's against the law, and that's what our lawsuit is trying to prove. Our lawsuit is trying to define what social emotional learning looks like in an elementary curriculum, because right now that's the goal. And if we can define that and what it looks like at that level, just think of all the other lawsuits that we can do and how we can get this out and how we can fight this even better. So I want to introduce our next speaker. Dr. James Lindsay is incredible. Jennifer McWilliams and James Lindsay are expert witnesses in our lawsuit. They both wrote us some very lengthy affidavits to help connect the dots between wit and wisdom and critical race theory and social emotional learning and all the damage it's doing to our children, because they are the experts. I think I was supposed to click past. Oh, back one. Sorry. Anyway, so Dr. James Lindsay is an author. He's a mathematician and a political commentator. Dr. Lindsay has written 8 books spanning a range of subjects, including religion, postmodern theory, and critical theory. He is a leading expert on critical race theory, which leads him to reject it completely. He is the founder of New Discourses, an organization dedicated to shining a light on the objective truth in subjective darkness, and is currently promoting his forthcoming book, The Marxification of Education. He is best known for the Grievance Studies Affair and the best-selling book, Cynical Theories, one of my favorites, which is currently being translated into more than 15 languages. He's been featured on Fox News, Glenn Beck, Joe Rogan, NPR, and so many others. Dr. Lindsay is an expert on the wide range of often nebulous critical theories affecting our schools and institutions, and we are honored to have him here tonight to shine a light for us. Please welcome Dr. James Lindsay. There he is. Hi. There you are. Thanks for being here. Thank you. There you go.
Hey, y'all. So Jennifer did an awesome job, so I'm going to not have a whole lot to do except add a little color to the canvas she put up for us. But I want to start off actually with what she finished with, where she said that they're afraid of you and that they're afraid of the truth. And the reason they're afraid of you is because you have the truth on your side. And the reason they're afraid of the truth is because the truth is a great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. If you're right, and if you're wrong, you're wrong. Doesn't matter if you're black or white, gay or straight. If you're right, and if you're wrong, you're wrong. The truth is a huge equalizer, and they, as you heard throughout Jennifer's talk, are very deceptive. They're lying. They're not just lying to you to be able to do this, lying to the American taxpayer to be able to get away with this, to get it paid for, lying to your children. They're even lying in many cases to themselves. They don't have the slightest idea what reality is any longer. But they want your children to be the vanguard of a future project that's a completely different society, and their goal to get there requires them to separate your children from you. So if you ask what social emotional learning is, and Jennifer already gave an excellent introduction, it is that. It is a project to separate your children from you. Separate your children from American culture, Tennessee values, your family, their religion, whatever it happens to be that ties them to the culture that they want to have changed and to bring them into the new culture. I want to add I know what Jennifer talked about is really scary, and I hate to tell you this, but it's going to get a lot scarier. And I don't know how to talk about social emotional learning without scaring the crap out of people. It's not come out yet, I just recently recorded a podcast. I didn't know what to do with it, but the thesis of the podcast is however much you currently trust social emotional learning, and even if that's negative 100 out of 100, you need to trust it less. However much you already trust it, you must trust it less. It is very, very, very dangerous. Jennifer characterized it as a type of thought reform. So let me get some color on that canvas there. So what is thought reform? Thought reform is a program of, reforming thought, but it's actually the translation that was given by a psychologist by the name of Robert J. Lifton to a program when he was studying the techniques that they use to change people's minds and attitudes and beliefs and values in the prisons in China under Mao Zedong when it converted to communism. The term in Chinese is xinao, which the Chinese, if you know anything about Chinese culture, are quite blunt with their language. And xinao means wash brain. It's brainwashing. And I have read Robert J. Lifton's books about brainwashing or thought reform, and I have read quite a lot about social emotional learning, and I have read quite a lot about the critical pedagogy that it makes use of, in particular Paulo Freire. She said I'd mention it. There we are. Paulo Freire's program of conscientization, which is something I will talk about here in a little bit. And I find that there is no daylight between these things. They are the same thing. So in the thought reform prisons that Mao ran, let me make this really clear also, the point of these prisons wasn't to lock people up to get them out of society. It was to thought reform them. It was to make them change how they think, to reform their thoughts or wash their brain, to wash out the old bad ways of thinking and habits of mind and bring in new clean ones. As a matter of fact, if you went to one of these prisons, you'd get arrested for some fake crime, like being called racist. Accused of espionage. And you'd get hauled in. They'd bring you up in front of a panel of inquisitors or whatever, a judge, and they would interrogate you, sometimes for hours, often in very uncomfortable circumstances. They very rarely physically abused people in these prisons. They might put you in handcuffs behind your back and make you sit in an uncomfortable position, but they didn't beat you up or anything like that. And they would tell you that you'd been accused of, say, espionage, or that you're a racist, or that you support transphobic ideas, or that you're a domestic terrorist, or that you are not gender affirming, or something of this kind. And then they would ask you to explain yourself. And you would try, but you didn't know why you were guilty. You had no idea what you had done to be accused of, specifically, usually espionage or crimes against the Chinese people. And so they would send you back to a prison cell after a lengthy interrogation, where you would be put in a cell with 7 or 8 other people who were further along the program than you. We call them peer learners in social emotional learning. And they would struggle you. Again, why do we call this thing a struggle session? When you have like one of these football people and they say something wrong on TV or they make an inappropriate comment, they have to go on TV and apologize, and they start crying, and they have to do all social emotional. I learned so much stuff. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Why do we call these things a struggle session? Because the Chinese called it dojang, which means struggle. Pipon dojang, critical struggle, because that's what they called it. So these struggle sessions that they put people through were to get you to want to confess to your crimes. That's the goal of them. In other words, it was to create a social pressure around you to get you to want to confess to the crimes that you'd been accused of. And the reason you weren't confessing, according to the Chinese prison, was that you didn't recognize your crime. So the goal of the thought reform prison was to get you to recognize the crime that you had committed against the Chinese people. And where you would be able to recognize that crime was from what they called the people's standpoint. I don't remember the Mandarin for that. The people's standpoint, in other words, is the communist standpoint. Those are the only people who count, the ones who represent the people. It's the standpoint of the oppressed. Now, in the goal of social emotional learning, when you talk about things like self-awareness or social awareness, is to understand the circumstances, to get your children to understand the circumstances that they find themselves in from the standpoint of the oppressed. So why do you use these circumstances, like Jennifer brilliantly pointed out with the example of the amusement park word problem? Does every family have a mom and a dad, for example? Well, some families have 2 moms. Well, now we can go right down the sex and sexuality domain and talk about that for the rest of the day because the child brought it up. The teacher didn't even have to introduce it. The child brought it up, so now we have a responsibility to talk about it. Why would they do that? Because they want to get the children to recognize the circumstance from the perspective of somebody who's oppressed by prevailing gender norms. They want to flip over or reform their thought to get them to understand the perspective of the oppressed, in this case by heteronormativity, or a little deeper in transnormativity, these 10-syllable words they've invented that are always something really bad that you've never heard of before like 22 minutes ago that you are somehow guilty of and always have been and are abusing your children by bringing them up in. The goal is to get the children to understand these things. And if you read Lifton on thought reform or brainwashing, what he says is the outstanding psychiatric fact of social and emotional, I did it wrong. The outstanding psychological fact of thought reform is that it penetrates into the social environment and inner emotions of the person who is being reformed. That's the outstanding fact, is it's to get into them. So they send them back to their prison cell, they make them get struggled in a social environment. Hey, we all are getting it, we're getting it, why aren't you getting it? Don't you want to get it? And you're being abused psychologically and sometimes physically by your cellmates while you're going through this. We want to wrap up the problem. We want to help you. That's the word they use, help, all the time. We want to help you. We want to help you confess so we can wrap up your case and get it over with. We want to help you understand the social environment and the systems of oppression that shape who we are and how we've become who we are. That's the language. We want to help you. We want to help you. We want to help you so we can resolve your case. To resolve your case, we have to get you to recognize your crimes. To recognize your crimes, you have to adopt the perspective of the people who are being harmed by it. In this case, whether it's the Chinese people or the oppressed, racial, sexual, gender, fat, disabled, whatever it happens to be. And I use the word fat because you're not allowed to use any of the more polite words that we use, because, like overweight, because overweight assumes an ideal weight, which reproduces fat phobia. I'm not kidding. That's how they do. That's Fat Studies 101. Fat Studies is a real academic discipline. You can't say things like overweight, just so you know. You can't say obese because that's a medical narrative that puts them into a medicalizing frame that suggests that it's unhealthy to be who they are, which further suggests that you wish they didn't exist or something like this. Because it's a disease to be cured, at which point there would be no fat. I'm not kidding. This is how they think. And this is how they want your children to think. Whether it's about fatness, disability, sex, gender, sexuality, race, etc. And those are the levers that they're using, but they are using particularly social and emotional cues to be able to do it. Now, something else Jennifer pointed out is with that word problem in specific is that the way that they actually accomplish this is a very innocuous thing. It doesn't look like they're doing it. They don't come out like full-throated like, and today, kids, we're going to learn about structural and systemic racism from Gloria Ladson-Billings. We're going to have our critical race theory lesson. Get out your critical race theory book. Let's learn critical race theory. They don't do that. They tuck it into the lesson. They hide it into the lesson. They give specific types of lessons, like the word problem that looked perfectly fine, or the survey question looked perfectly innocuous, and use them according to a model that was back in the 60s and 70s named the Generative Themes Approach. This was named by Paulo Freire. The goal of a generative theme is to generate the conversation, or to generate the emotional response. It's to make the children, or make the learners, as they call them, have either the question come up so that they can discuss it, or have that emotional response that they can use to radicalize people. And this, I do mean radicalize. Because Paulo Freire, he said that the reason that you're going to use generative themes when he wrote down his model of education, which is called the pedagogy of the oppressed, which teaches you to see from the perspective of the oppressed, the people's standpoint. When he wrote this down, he said that the purpose of a generative theme is, in fact, to engage with the learner at the level of their emotions. It is to get them engaged in the material, and then what would happen is if you get them engaged, say with that math word problem, and you get them excited about talking about amusement parks and moms and dads, that they're going to be so interested in the subject that they're going to want to solve the math problem. Could you imagine Wanting to solve that math problem after you divert into a conversation for 45 minutes about having two moms, do you care that the answer was 30 miles? As it turns out, studies have shown that it doesn't work. What it does actually is radicalize people, and they see no interest in learning. They see interest in becoming political activists. They actually are described in some experimental studies they did of the Paulo Freire method, the generative method in Africa that they did in 2007. They said that the learners were turned into emotional wrecks, as a matter of fact, who, instead of wanting to learn, just screamed for change, broke down in tears, accused the people trying to teach them of being complicit in the problem, turned on their teachers, in other words. So just like under Mao's China, the students turned on their teachers. This is what this program is designed to do. And here's how the generative theme thing works. That's hard to say. The way that the generative themes thing works is that you're actually going to steal education from people. Because you have to keep the outer shape of it, but what you're going to do is you're going to take out all of the actual educational content, like the math content of that word problem. And what you're going to do is you're going to leave the shell of it, so the word problem's still there. You take out all the math content, nobody wants to solve the problem, and then you're going to put in what he said is political literacy. Paulo Freire said the real point of education is to develop political literacy, not actual literacy. Actual literacy is a subsidiary of political literacy. In fact, it's a political fact as to whether or not you can read or not. So actually learning to read is already a political thing, so it doesn't matter. What actually matters is developing a political literacy. And he says the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use a generative theme. How do you gather one of those? Well, you talk to the learners or you survey them about subjects that are important in their lives. So that relentless surveying and social emotional learning meets this agenda. You get information from the children, just like Jennifer said with the surveys, and then you use the information that you gather from the children, you feed it back to them as the basis for the lesson plan. But when you feed it back to them, he said you do so in a codified way, which is a fancy way of saying that you've passed it through a lens, like the equity lens that she presented. You're going to understand whether or not people can go to an amusement park through equity. You're going to understand whether or not people have a mom and a dad through equity. You're going to understand through this Marxist lens of consciousness. So if the word, all of these things that she presented as evidence and that Tricia could tell you about in the lawsuit that are presented as evidence happening right here in this county, in these schools, murder, suicide, sadness, grief, amusement park even. It can be a positive word. It doesn't have to be these negative words, these inappropriate topics. Robin introduced, a dozen of or whatever at the very beginning of this entire evening. You're going to take those concepts, you're going to pass them through the equity lens, and then you're going to feed them back to the kids to try to get the emotional reaction and then engage them at their emotional level and then get them to understand that topic in terms of the equity lens. And then they will be conscious to the real conditions of their lives. That's a Marxist way of saying that they're going to have been brainwashed. And they're going to understand the topic through the equity lens. And let me just pause. I don't know if you've ever heard the definition of equity. The definition of equity literally comes out of the field of public administration. It came from the Minnowbrook Conference held in 1968 in the field of public administration, hosted by the author of the book, The Administrative State, whose name is Dwight Waldo, which he wrote in 1948. So 20 years later, they have the Minnowbrook Conference, number 2 or 12 or whatever number it was, and they define the concept of social equity within public bureaucracies and say that public bureaucracies don't have to just be economical, they don't have to just be efficient, they also have to add a 30, they have to be equitable. And so they defined equity as redistributing shares and access so that citizens and groups are made more equal. Now there's an older idea, which is that you say take somebody's money and you redistribute that money so that people are made equal, and we call that socialism. That's literally the definition of socialism, a redistribution, an administered redistribution scheme where people's resources are taken and redistributed so that people are made more equal. It's the exact same definition. So when they pass it through an equity lens, they're passing it through a socialism lens, a redistribution lens. And as a matter of fact, since they're using the Paulo Freirean method of conscientization, and an explicit goal of social emotional learning in their literature, page after page after page, is that they're doing so to raise critical consciousness, that's exactly what Paulo Freire wanted to raise. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian Marxist educator who was redesigning education to teach Marxism. To teach not Marxism as a theory, but just to make people have Marxist consciousness. And that's the purpose of social emotional learning. It's a very sophisticated tool to do that. Now, you might think that brainwashing people makes them uncomfortable. That you all, if you have kids, and a lot of you I know do, or grandkids, you know kids are smart. You know kids catch on. You know kids have a pretty keen sense, maybe not at first, but eventually, that they're being led into some BS. They're not idiots. So this generates another phrase that Jennifer pointed out a lot, which is something called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the psychological experience you have when something that you believe to be true and the evidence in front of you don't match. Or when you're forced to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time that don't match. You become psychologically uncomfortable. Think about any time in your life where you've been committed, you think something, you believe something's true, and suddenly you get that piece of evidence that says, wait a minute, something's different here. This doesn't fit. And that thing you thought before can't possibly be true in light of what you just saw. You immediately become anxious. You immediately become uncomfortable. That feeling is called cognitive dissonance. And so UNESCO, which was another organization that Jennifer pointed out is instrumental. It's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. UNESCO published a document in 2019 carrying the title SEL for SDGs, Social Emotional Learning for the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. And what did they say the purpose of social emotional learning is in that document? To manage the cognitive dissonance that comes with teaching children that their job in life is to satisfy and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. Social emotional learning, they said, is a perfect program for this. It is the perfect program for teaching the children to manage the cognitive dissonance that will come up when they are given mutually contradictory Sustainable Development Goals and told that it's their duty to solve them. Or when they're going through some of these lessons and it doesn't seem to match up, the systemic or structural lesson that they're being taught doesn't seem to match up with their experience in life or what their parents taught them. They're going to experience cognitive dissonance. And social emotional learning is a perfect tool for teaching them to manage their emotions and to deal with the cognitive dissonance so that they can continue with the lesson. So this is the moment when I read that, when I said this is however much you trust social emotional learning, you need to trust it a lot less. Because the United Nations is publishing documents 3 years ago saying that its purpose is that when we turn your kids into activists, your kids are going to realize something's wrong. And social emotional learning is the perfect tool to get them to override that impulse that something's wrong. Which means it's also the perfect tool to get them to override the impulse that something's wrong when they're being taught something about critical race theory, or when they're being taught something about sex, gender, and sexuality that doesn't match up, or when they're being pressured into the direction of possibly considering transitioning or something of this kind. It gives them the resolution to that problem in accordance with the equity lens, and then gives them the psychological manipulation tools in order to manage their feelings of discomfort, disquiet, that alarm bell ringing in their head saying something's not right. It teaches them to overcome that and to be resilient in the face of the challenges that they're having in their new socially and emotionally geared education system. Now, what is resilience? Well, it's the opposite of fragility. So if somebody accuses you of being a racist and you say, but I'm not racist, this is ridiculous, that's rude, that's offensive, we're not going to do this, I reject that, I'm not going to give that label any power. They say that you're just exhibiting your white fragility. Being white resilient would be accepting the accusation and doing the hard work of transforming yourself. So teaching them to overcome that impulse and to be resilient in the face of accusations of racism, homophobia, sexism, misogyny, transphobia, and so on, so that they will learn to do the work in the equity frame is one of the purposes of social emotional learning. So this really is a program of thought reform. And at this point, the feeling that I think you should probably have, not that I'm one to tell people how they should feel about things, is that, holy crap, the school building's on fire and I need to get my kid out. the school building is on fire and I need to get my kid out of there and protect my kid. And I say that you are right. You need to protect your children from this. You need to protect your children from this psychological manipulation that, as Jennifer pointed out, is classified under mental health interventions for them, which, by the way, is not just a lever for them to be able to do it, to invoke confidentiality, as she pointed out, but it's also a lever for them to extort from the federal government massive amounts of money through, say, Title I, for example, for disabilities, and through this new COVID-related CARES Act for the trauma that COVID has brought on everybody. Let me give you a little idea of these manipulations, these lies that they like to tell, that has enabled rivers of money to flow into this. I do not know, so apologize for not knowing. I apologize, but I do not know if it's in Tennessee. I do not know if it's in Williamson County or Franklin. I do know that it's in Utah and at least 40 states. Tennessee might be one of the 10 that it's not in. I don't know. But it doesn't matter. It will be in all 50, unless it's put to a stop or removed from the ones that it's already in. In order to be able to qualify for some of that money, what they were able to do is they realized that there's this river of money that can flow into children that are at risk. The kids that you would think that a program like social emotional learning, led by school counselors or guidance counselors who are actually trained psychologists in one-on-one environments with kids who have trouble. That's what you think you're buying when you buy social emotional learning, by the way. You think, yeah, man, some kids have a tough home life. Their parents aren't going to be there. It'd be great if there's something they can do, with the school that helps them get a leg up. Some kids have behavioral problems. They get stressed out. They get pissed off, or whatever it is. The math lesson really tweaks some people so bad that they're experimenting with putting heart monitors on kids to see how much math stresses them out, and gathering lots of data as they do it. They call that heart math. It's an entire corporation, as a matter of fact. And you think, well, those kids could use some help. Some kids are having a hard time getting along in their social environment. And so you think, yeah, we'll take them out of class, we'll give them 30 minutes with a counselor a couple times a week to manage their social and emotional things into the way that the impacts their learning. That's what you think you're buying. But that's not what you're buying. You're buying transformative social emotional learning implemented on a systemic scale through every subject period. And what that, like I already said, what that's all for, it's that thought reform program. What they are doing with that is they are saying that, well, kids who are at risk, which you're thinking over there, but they're thinking all the kids who are at risk get special money from the federal government because of the CARES Act, ESSER funding, and so on, right? So what if we said that all these kids are at risk of graduating not college and career ready, or college and career ready means socially and emotionally competent according to the CASEL competency list. And that's exactly what they did. They redefined college and career readiness in terms of graduating, in terms of having all of your CASEL social emotional competencies, said every kid is at risk of not graduating with this because these programs are not fully formed and fully implemented yet. So every kid is at risk, and now we can bring in rivers of federal money from the CARES Act, et cetera, in order to fund the school with the specific purpose of funding social emotional learning programs so they can alleviate that at-risk status. Meanwhile, every single child has been classified at risk under a bogus definition, gets treated as at risk, and thus is justified at being used, or in having used on them a mental health program that in turn turns out to actually be brainwashing. In fact, redo the entire curriculum in terms of this program for every kid, because every kid suffers this. And they're getting billions upon billions of taxpayer dollars to fund it under all these bogus pretenses. And this is the kind of manipulation that they've used if you kind of wonder, how in the world did this happen? That's part of it. That's kind of this 2022 end of it. It really started, though, in 2015, although CASEL was from 94. Jennifer's right. It came out of the New Age spirituality cult called the Fetzer Institute off of the work of Alice Bailey. I will not talk about Alice Bailey publicly tonight. I have started to read Alice Bailey's books. I strongly urge you on your own time, and if you have a chance to write this down, you should write this down, to look up the name of the publishing company that Alice Bailey created to publish her books. It's currently called, I'll spell it for you, the Lucis Trust, Lucis Trust. Look up where its office is. I'll give you a hint. I won't make you do your homework. 866 United Nations Plaza. Look up what it used to be called. That I won't tell you. Look up Alice Bailey's books and read it. That I also won't tell you about tonight. She told you the truth. This came out of this weird New Age thing, but it wasn't in 1994 or 5 when they started laying the groundwork for this that it got put into implementation. That follows the decision in 2015, after Common Core wasn't working out anymore so well, to follow the suggestions of a woman named Linda Darling Hammond, that's a hyphenated last name if you're looking to spell it, who urged them to pass an act through Congress called the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, of 2015. The Every Student Succeeds Act requires, remember with Common Core, all the teachers complaining about how they had to do all this new reporting of all the things they were teaching and all the new competency stuff, blah, 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 and they had all this extra work? And it was like, how do you teach math according to the Common Core framework? How do you teach history according to the Common Core framework? Set aside whether or not the lessons are nonsense or scary or that's not how you should learn math. Set all that aside. The teachers had to go report, this is what we do to implement it in our class. This is what we do to implement it in our class. Paperwork went through the roof for teachers under Common Core, and ESSA required them to report on at least one non-academic competency area. And Castle deployed an army of consultants to start installing social emotional learning to meet the new requirement. That's how it actually got into the schools. That's how it actually took off like a rocket ship. And you say, 10 years ago, nobody was even talking about this. No, they weren't. Because 10 years ago was 2012, which is before that passed. And 10 years ago, schools had a choice as to whether or not they were going to report on a non-academic competency or not to the federal government if they wanted federal academic money. Now, they do not have that choice. And Castle stepped in and made sure social emotional learning would fill the gap. Now, I haven't even given you a reason to not trust social emotional learning yet, a proper one. Let's go scary, and then we'll try to see if we can find some hope at the end of the rainbow. So thought reform's scary. They want to brainwash your kid. It turns out, though, that the other thing Jennifer pointed out that's extremely important to pay attention to is that this is a data-driven program. And I've drawn a circle, just like she had a circle. I've drawn a circle when I talk about the data-driven thing. I want you to think of this kind of like a roundabout. I know we're in Tennessee, but bear with me here. A roundabout on the road that has 2 exits. So the social emotional learning is the roundabout. You're going around and around and around. This involves the data gathering, the implementing the data through the generative themes to brainwash, to bring them into the equity lens or the social justice lens or the conscientization or whatever you want to call it, the critical consciousness. That's going around and around the roundabout. And so what are they doing with all this data that they're gathering? Well, one of the 2 off-ramps is to feed it back into the kids, to brainwash the kids, to think the way that they're supposed to think about social emotional learning programs. Or social emotional learning topics, competencies. How should you manage your relationships? How should you manage yourself? How should you be aware of yourself? How should you deal with these kinds of things? Well, through an equity lens, through an equity lens, through an equity lens, through an equity lens. So they have to gather the data to find out what to feed back into the kids to get the programming to stick. Now, what's the other thing they might do with the data? The other thing that you can do with the data is you can take that data and you can contour the world that the children are exposed to based on what you now know about them. So a lot of these kinds of surveys are just plain surveys, but a lot of the games and quizzes and things that they might get them to play on their device, say between lessons to relax, what kind of a princess are you? What kind of a rock are you? What kind of a dinosaur are you? Blah, blah, blah. Which historical figure from the story we just read are you? Those kinds of games and quizzes are often Big 5 personality inventory tests that in 5 or 6 questions at a time or 10 questions at a time for the quiz don't do anything, but on the aggregate, when you take 1,000 questions over the course of a school year, are a full battery of personality inventory questions. The World Economic Forum brags with its social emotional learning ed tech initiatives, openly brags that one of the things that they're doing is creating even finer grained psychological profiles of people using the data than the Big 5 personality inventories allow. What can you do with that data? Well, according to what they, about your kids, this is just in case you forgot what we're talking about. We're talking about your children. You can brainwash them because you know their proclivities, you know what sets them off, you know what triggers them, you know what gets them an emotional reaction, you know what calms them down. So you can do all that. You can actually educate them better, which is the sales pitch. But you can also conform the algorithms that they interact with on their devices or social media so that it advertises to them in a way that's particularly suited to make them perfectly controllable consumers. You can also advertise to them or propagandize them in ways so that they have the correct attitudes or the correct information feed according to their personality. What will shift and move, in the actual technical word they use for this is nudge theory being the thing, nudge them into the correct political views and attitudes on any given topic. So there's a paper written in 2019 by a man named Ben Williamson talking about social emotional learning programs. He's interested in who's funding it, he's interested in who's implementing it and pushing it, he's interested in how it works, and he says that the number one thing they talk about in virtually every document is, and this is true in every document I've read, is that they need more data. They need to gather data. And his suspicion is that it's actually a data gathering front. Not just to use that data for the off-ramp number one to use to brainwash or even better educate your children, but secondly, in his own words, to gather what he calls psychodata, to create what he calls a psychocracy, a government ruled by psychological manipulation. And the goal, he says, of these entities, and he names the World Economic Forum, the OECD, the World Bank, the United Nations, specifically UNESCO, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Templeton Foundation, and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, specifically, if you want the list of the ones he names from what I can remember. The goal of gathering that data is to make a perfectly predictable and manipulable economic situation with perfectly predictable and nudgeable consumers and perfectly controllable population under governmentality and control. The goal is to gather enough information about your kids, not just to build a social credit profile that will force them to behave the way that they want them to behave, but also so that they will use the algorithms in their social media interactive devices to make sure that they are encountering information only that will push them in desired directions, both government, in terms of government control and in terms of economics. It is to create a perfectly controlled society. We call that slavery. Your children will earn fake money that is a digital currency in that by providing the data to the people who want to control them, because that data is valuable, because it enables their control. They will give them fake currency in the form of digital currencies that are couponable or programmable. If they don't want you to buy beef with that money, your money's good for everything but beef. If they don't think that you should travel more than however many miles, when you've traveled however many miles, your money's not good anymore, etc. Perfectly programmable currencies that are based off of the data that they're providing to the regime, that the regime will then use in turn to control them, both economically and politically. And that is Ben Williamson's suggestion as to what the program of social emotional learning is actually about. This turns out to be kind of backed up by the documents from UNESCO, USAID, and the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum is particularly giddy about this. I don't know if you guys know what the World Economic Forum is. I don't want to go on all night. But the World Economic Forum is a very creepy organization that started in 1971 with the goal of bringing together big business leaders first in Europe, but then also political leaders. It's the thing that its leader, Klaus Schwab, its executive chairman, Klaus Schwab, bragged that they had penetrated many of the cabinets of the leaders of the government and then led them to make all the COVID-19 decisions that they made to control populations like in Canada, where most of their top tier of their federal government is actually World Economic Forum associates. Young global leaders, they call them. It is a massive who's who, I don't know how to exactly describe it, networking hub for global control, and it has this as its educational vision for the future through educational technology. And what they suggest in a paper that they put out in 2016, that's 6 years ago, on social emotional learning specifically, is that ed tech is going to be the way to do it. So what do they suggest that they're going to do to gather this data at that level of granularity that they're going to be able to do these kinds of things that Ben Williamson worries about? Well, wearable technology is one of the things that they suggest. Beyond just surveys, beyond question and answers, beyond observations of the teachers, one of the things that they suggest is wearable technologies. They can wear heart monitors to find out how their heart rate changes. They can wear like an Apple Watch or something of that kind, which also measures not just heart rate, but the skin conductance as it changes. with the goal of inferring the emotional state of the children while they're in academic, learning, and social interactions so that they can be better intervened upon by the teachers so that their emotions can be better managed. They talk about the idea of using AI-driven digital friends. So the friend that you tell all your secrets to is a machine that's owned by Microsoft. It's not your friend that you whisper to, all the things, I kissed somebody for the first time, or whatever, behind the bed, and you hope your parents don't hear through the closed door. You're now talking to not even a friend by text message. You're talking to an AI that can ask all the right kinds of probing questions to find out more while it records all of your data. Your digital friends, your digital learning assistants, eye tracking to find out what the kids are paying attention to, effective computing that approximates their emotions and tries to manipulate their emotions and find out exactly what it is that they're feeling and how to make them feel certain things. And then I take you back to Robert Lifton with the thought reform. The outstanding psychiatric fact of thought reform is that it penetrates into the social and emotional experience of its target. The outstanding fact is that it penetrates into the emotional life. These are the kinds of things that Klaus suggests. This is not like brain implants and all that. This is just using existing technology you already know exists to monitor and gather reams and reams and reams of data on your children. Now, just to make this plausible for you that they could create massive instruments of control out of this, let me give you a for instance. This is not school, this is John Deere. Tractors. John Deere sells tractors, they're very expensive. You don't own your tractor anymore when you buy a John Deere tractor. But your John Deere tractor is super high tech because of the software that it has. That's why you can't own it, by the way, because that's proprietary. You can't own the copyright to the program that they put in the tractor. You can own the machine, but you couldn't own the copyright to the software that makes it go. And this software allows them to do all kinds of things with sensors on the tractor to measure soil density, soil hardness, mineral content, water content of the soil. So you drive around doing your tractor stuff with your tractor on your farm, whatever tractor stuff is. I'm a city boy, I guess. I don't know. And it's measuring all kinds of stuff. And it can actually make a centimeter by centimeter grid of your farm in terms of all these cool things about the soil. Where do you need fertilizer? Where do you need minerals? Where do you need water? Where do you need to go bust up the soil a little bit and aerate? All the soil density. It can measure all that and give the farmer, you can go log on, John Deere, whatever, go to your account, go to your tractor, go to your farm, and there you find it, a map, centimeter by centimeter of your farm, telling you exactly where you need it. And you think, well, that's great. That's going to improve farming a lot. They're going to save water, they're going to save materials, fertilizers, minerals, blah, blah, blah. They're not just going to go out and broadcast that stuff, fry some plants, help other plants. They can go down to a targeted 1 centimeter by centimeter grid. But it turns out that John Deere, in turn, profits by selling that data to futures traders who bet against the farmer because they can make better predictions on what the yields will be from those farms than the farmers can themselves. So when the farmer's trying to guess what the price of the soybeans he's growing might be, the futures traders with a supercomputer can make a better guess, can bet against the farmer, short the farmer, and actually rip the farmer off. And John Deere is selling them the data to be able to do it, and you have absolutely no rights under the licensing agreement to stop that. Now take it out of the tractor in your farm and put it into your child. That's what social emotional learning is for. In addition to using that to transform your child into the perfect consumer and the perfect political object. And that's all in their documentation about the programs. So however much you trust social emotional learning, you need to trust social emotional learning less. Jennifer did a great job. That word problem, I don't want to keep talking about it. I'm just struck by how good of an example that is about how they will transform an innocuous piece of curriculum into a political discussion by using little keywords or key topics like mom and dad, something that seems perfectly normal to people, to dredge up a political discussion out of the kids. Of course, you all will know about the drag queens. That's literally the purpose of the Drag Queen Story Hour. If you didn't know what that was for, it's to create the provocation that causes the children to ask the question. How do I know that? They wrote a paper in one of the leading academic curriculum journals explaining that's the point. It is a generative project. It is to induce children into asking questions and into viewing alternative ways of being and modes of kinship, alternative modes of kinship. So when they say it's family friendly, in the paper they tell you that the point of family friendly advertising is that it's family friendly in the sense of the queer family you leave your family for to find on the street. It's queer code. They say that. And the way that it works is by using a generative object, in this case a drag queen, a man dressed as a woman in a provocative way, specifically to get the kids to start asking, why are you a boy dressed as a girl? So they can reply with, do boys have to dress like boys? Can't they dress other ways? What are other ways of being a boy or a girl? And then you're off to the races, and then social emotional learning sweeps in and makes sure that they get the equity frame brainwashing or thought reform on that particular topic. This is how they're doing what they're doing to your children. This is why I said the building's on fire and you need to protect your kids. Now, this isn't actually as terrible and awful as it sounds. It is, but it's more hopeful than you might think because it's also extremely fragile. Their entire program depends literally on one of two things. One is that they can continue to defraud 300 million of us. Or two, that they can force 300 million of us. Those are their only options. They can steal education from our children and our society by these lies, or they can force it. And if we see through the lies, if all we do is understand this and start telling other people about it and get enough people to understand it, not to go crazy and do something stupid, but just to start speaking up and making the lies they're telling visible, they can't advance except by force, which everybody recognizes as illegitimate and will be their downfall. They are actually backed into a corner. They are actually already panicking, and you can tell by the way that they react to the various things that come out. So you should really take a lot of hope. And what can you do? You can tell people about this. And what I find is that telling people isn't actually a very effective thing to do. You need to show them. You can show them examples of these exact documents. How do you find them? Go to the search engine. Go to UNESCO, UNESCO, UNESCO. Type in UNESCO SEL. Download the documents. Now you have them, and start reading through them yourself. They're not even that hard to read. They're boring. And they have advanced a gigantic agenda by publishing thousands of pages of actionable and legal junk that's too boring for normal people to bother reading through. Yeah, there's some stuff like you need to know Marxist terminology, which I didn't actually talk that much about. I have a podcast, New Discourses podcast. I've recorded at least 16 hours on social emotional learning already and about 150 hours on education and the lies that they use to do education. You can go listen. You can learn all about Marxist terminology all over, for instance, my website or lots of other websites, lots of other places. You don't have to take my words for it. You can go learn it yourself. It's not actually that hard if you sit down and buckle down and think exactly like my wife is now thinking. My wife is like, well, I used to think I had to call, let's say a guy to come fix a thing in my yard. Well, he had to learn it somewhere. I can learn how to do that. And so she's teaching herself carpentry. Turns out you can learn to read these documents and say, what the heck is this? And then you can show, hey guys, you see where this thing says that the point of social emotional learning is to ease cognitive dissonance as they try to force kids to become activists? That's what it says. And you say, well, that's probably just some weirdo. No, that's UNESCO. You can point these things out. You get more and more people to understand this, and they don't have the grounds to continue to lie and to continue to force these things through. You do like my friend Lisa Logan has done, and you expose what they did in the state of Utah with changing the definition of at risk, and you can call foul. The problem is that too many of us don't have the ability or the patience to call fair and foul balls here. But redefining at risk so that they can manipulate it in order to get lots of money to fund something illegitimate is a fair and foul ball call that people understand immediately when you point it out. It doesn't take hard work. All it takes is the willingness to look at boring, tedious, bureaucratic writing about the subject that you're interested in and then to show some people. I'm telling you, it's all it takes. You just have to show people what they're actually up to, and we can actually stop this thing. Of course, no shade to the lawyers. Suing is where that's eventually going to go. And they are going to do the yeoman's work on this stuff as we expose how this stuff works. Jennifer talked about the domino effect. The lawsuits are going to start to fall, the precedence is going to start to tip, and we're going to be able to expose bit by bit how they did this. And we're going to be able to save future generations of children from these manipulations. Now, I did say future generations. You have to protect your kids first. I want to kind of finish with a pro-family message because I need you to understand something very important about this. The number one thing that they need for this idiotic vision to work, or at least to attempt it, is for them to be able to destroy the relationship between you and your children. And they are working as hard as they can to sow the seeds that will cause your kids to come home and think that you're out of date, you're obsolete, you're an old fogey, you're backwards, you're bigoted, you're a fascist, or whatever it happens to be. Above all else, and especially if your kids are younger, take time and energy every single day to make sure that they know that relationship that you have with them is number one. Nourish and protect your families, because if they can split the family, they can win, and if they can't split the family, they have no hope. Everybody here who is a parent or a grandparent is therefore on exactly the front line, the frontest of the front lines, the vanguard front line of what's going on here, because you have the ability to protect your kids and reach your kids and make sure your kids have a solid grounding and solid values that aren't going to be swayed by this. You also have the ability to make decisions like opting out of surveys, putting pressure on the school boards, putting pressure on local politicians, becoming the school board, as some of you are, becoming local politicians, putting pressure on state politicians, becoming state politicians. Somebody has to do that. You're somebody. You are on the front line, though, with your kids and their ability to sever the relationship between you and your kids. Don't underestimate the power of this stuff to get in a kid's head, especially a teenager, and speaking as a man, especially a teenage girl, and put a wedge between you and your daughter or your son. It's very, very important that you nourish and protect those relationships and make sure those things are number one. And there is nothing higher, nothing more important to do than that. So nourish your families, nourish your neighborhoods, and tell your friends they need to do the same, because this is the scariest thing any generation of children in this country have ever faced. And if we are successful, maybe will ever face. And maybe we didn't want it, and maybe we got better stuff to do, or we like to pretend we have better stuff to do than saving our kids and saving our country. But we don't. You don't have anything better to do. They're your kids. Either you're going to parent them, or the government is going to decide it's going to do this to them in lieu of parenting them. Sure. All right, so this actually comes up once in a while. The question, if you didn't hear, was how in the world did I end up on NPR? Did I talk about CRT? What was the reception? That was actually a long time ago. I put it on the bio because it's kind of funny that I got an NPR, and it always kind of gets people to raise an eyebrow. And then other people don't know what to do with it because they're like, wow, he was on a left-wing thing? It was in 2018, so it's been a while since NPR wanted to talk to me. It was in the wake of the Grievance Studies Affair. I don't have time to discuss what the Grievance Studies Affair was. But after the Grievance Studies Affair, everybody wanted to talk. Everybody wanted to talk to us. And I talked to this guy for like 35, 40 minutes for what was going to be a 7-minute spot. I now have enough media savvy to know that's dangerous because they're going to cut it and I'm not. But I talked to this guy, and it was pleasant, and there were parts where he pushed me really vigorously. So we did talk about critical race theory topics, and we talked about academic papers mostly, and academic publishing in these topics, and why why it's important to get these things right. And it turns out that a friend of mine is kind of a media guy, and he was listening in to it with me secretly. And he said that it sounded very much like the guy was definitely not on my side, and that I actually changed his mind. And when they finally published the thing, they were very, very, very generous to me, very charitable to me. They made me look very good. They didn't make me look like a lunatic or anything else. So maybe I did actually reach the guy, I don't know. But I was on NPR one time. They haven't called in 4 years. I don't think they're going to call anytime soon. But I was on the BBC the other day, so you never know. So anyway, thank you guys for having me. I don't want to keep you all night. Appreciate you. SEL. Don't trust it. Fight against it. Protect your kids. That's all you got. All you got to know. Thank you. If you want. She wants to know if you have questions. Beware, y'all. Y'all don't know your danger. I will talk. I will answer questions. I went to Chicago, before you hear your question, I went to Chicago on purpose with COVID in January, and they had a vaccine mandate. They'll be all right. And so I went to Chicago on purpose with COVID in January, and I had a event at the University of Chicago there, and I talked for like 35, 40 minutes with COVID in the winter. It was cold, it hurt. And they asked questions, and I answered questions for about 3 hours. So you do not know your peril. I will not stop talking as long as you're interested to hear things. Now, go ahead. Okay, so the who are they part is not hard for me to answer whatsoever unless there are people behind the theys that I know about. So that is entirely possible. How they're getting the teachers to accept it, I'm not actually sure, except that I know that they're forcing them to all go through these trainings. And the teachers who are kind of opposed to it are like, this is BS, and they quit. And the teachers who have been brought up in it in the colleges and universities in the past 10 to 15 years, who don't think differently already, come in and think, oh, this is great, and this is how we do things. A lot of the people who are becoming teachers through a process that's known as selection bias. Selection bias is when the people who enter into a field or enter into a project or a hobby or whatever have some predisposition that makes them interested in being that kind of person. So people who want to be teachers have certain dispositions, and the people that are selecting themselves to be teachers are often people who have these kind of activist mentalities. You see this, for example, on the Libs of TikTok videos, where you find all these kind of gay activists who said that they wanted to become a teacher specifically so they could become a gay role model for kids because it was something they didn't have when they were growing up. So you have this kind of outsized number of identity-based activists wanting to get into teaching, not necessarily for activist type agendas and the like, let's transform society necessarily, although that's often there, but because they want to be the role model of a particular type of mode of being or whatever, whether that's gay or trans or whether it's race activist or civil rights leader or whatever it happens to be. So there's this kind of biasing toward teachers becoming more and more of that. That's kind of, there's a filter at the schools, at the colleges of education that reinforces it, and then they're going through trainings and having it as a job requirement to do it, so that kind of selects who stays and who goes. So I think that's how they're getting teachers to go along with it. A lot of them aren't any more informed than the average Joe out on the street about what SEL really is. It's just the new thing everybody's doing, and so they do it. Now, who are the they? Well, I named the theys. I actually named them. Ben Williamson in his paper criticizing SEL names them. They brag about it. UNESCO is one of the theys. That's the United Nations. So the people working the World Core Curriculum and Education for All at the United Nations and the UNESCO branches that reach into education are some of the theys. They are the people putting money, effort, and programs behind this. The one they I didn't name, or I did name actually, is CASEL. Jennifer talked about CASEL a lot, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning. This is funded heavily by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We read in Williamson that it's also funded heavily, and we saw that on Jennifer's slide, by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. The Fetzer Institute and the Lucis Trust has a peculiar amount of money behind it. I don't know why that is. I actually don't know why that is. They have a strange amount of money behind it. The Templeton Foundation, the OECD, which is what, the Occupational Organization of Economic and something development. I can't remember. OECD, big world organization. World Bank. The World Economic Forum has been pushing social emotional learning and banging that drum for at least 6 years. USAID. If it's a large international NGO or large funding operation like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Tides Foundation, they're probably involved. Now, a lot of people are also going along with it because if you're an institution and you have, say, pension funds for your employees, especially if you're like a state institution, then your institution has an ESG score, and the S is determined by how socially active and correct you are, and the ESG score determines a ton about your access to investment capital and how the biggest financial banks are going to treat you, what kind of interest rates they'll offer you, whether they'll carry you if you're a corporation or not. So there are also massive economic incentives that have been baked into the whole rigged game in order to get people to want to go along with this and to pay a penalty if they don't. Technically, you get to choose, but major institutions like universities will work really hard to back things like this up and provide infrastructure underneath it, specifically because their ESG score depends on it, and if their ESG score is bad, their mortgages are probably going to see an increased variable rate. Your average university right now has about a $200 million debt in mortgage at present, and they have gigantic administrative bloat that makes it hard for them to pay that bill down, so they're really sensitive to these financial pressures. So they are the biggest players and organizations. If I had to narrow it down to just a couple, though, I would tell you it's the World Economic Forum and the United Nations are overwhelmingly the people most strongly behind this, and they're working hand in glove with our federal government and its Department of Education, which is basically just implementing everything they want all the time. So that's who the theys are. Lots of theys, but they're all kind of these same shadowy organizations that get named. Well, they're not, the United Nations isn't shadowy, it's just weird. They get named over and over and over again because we're kind of closing in on the small and the relatively small list of the people who are actually pulling the strings and financing the purses to make this go. So that's who the theys are, and how your average teacher is going along with it. I hate to say it, they probably don't know better. Yes, ma'am. Oh no.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Carry on. So we're going to talk about the savings accounts in Arizona.
Well,